I want to thank the class of 2009 for inviting me here to speak. Congratulations, you made it. Though I think your choice says a lot about how this class sees their future. I'll explain. You chose a Wellesley grad who spent the first decade of her career broke, begging for freelance work, who constantly heard she was underqualified or later overqualified, that means old, or basically just plain wrong for whatever it was she wanted to do. She eventually ended up with a really great job doing exactly what she wanted to do, exactly where she wanted to do it, in the Middle East. Then she got hit by a car bomb. They nearly took her legs off. She had to come back from the dead roughly 5 times and learn how to walk again. So it tells me a lot about you and your current state of mind that you all thought you needed to hear from me and whatever lessons I had to offer from those experiences as you leave college for the rest of your life. So, in short, you all want to know how to be bomb-proof, right? So you're right, I learned a lot. Most of all, that every time I ran into a wall, I had 2 choices on how to face it, hope or fear. That would be the fear part. You don't always choose what happens to you or where you end up, but you can choose how you respond to it and why you do what you do. Now, from the headlines about the economy, for which I, as a member of the media, am partly responsible, you would all think you're going to end up, let's see, waiters, bartenders, Kelly secretaries. Does anyone know what that is? That's a temporary secretary. Now, I hate to tell you, I've been all of those. Now, the good news is in every single one of those jobs, I learned something incredibly valuable in terms of skills. I also learned that the jobs did not have to define me. How I did them defined me. And each one simply became sometimes a sideways step, but a step towards where I was ultimately aiming for. What I hope you find or choose is that you're not defined by your job or your major, but by an internal compass of your own making. And that wherever you end up, and believe me, you will end up in jobs that you think are beneath you, pitted against bosses or professors you think don't appreciate you or understand you. And I hope when you run into those walls, you will learn to do what I've had to learn the really hard way. You step back and say, okay, why am I here? Was it for the title or the prestige? Or is it what I hope to accomplish in this job or on this planet? Your work becomes just part of a mission. So I'll tell you how I found my mission, so to speak, and how that process got me through that little car bomb you might have heard about. Now, I stand before you able to walk without a limp and run when they originally considered taking both my legs off. I healed better than any of my doctors ever predicted, and they tell me part of that is their skill, part of that is that, like Mona was saying, I had my loved ones next to me. They pull you through. And the rest is whatever you bring with you into that crisis, or in my case, into that operating theater. I brought a certain amount of quiet, determined attitude, honed by years of being told no or not possible when it came to my job. Wrong time, wrong place, wrong voice, and boy, I got a lot of wrong face. Then there was always one person who was willing to give me a chance, a long shot, like the Stevens Fellowship, and I took it. So when I woke up from the bombing at Lunchville Regional Medical Center and the doctors told me, you may never walk properly again, I looked at him and said, yeah, thanks. Heard that one before. The doctor left and this amazing nurse I'll never forget walked in, Nancy Miller. She was taking care of me most of the time. And she said, you know, I know he's trying to be realistic, but he doesn't know what you're capable of. You don't know at this point what you're capable of. Take it one step, 1 hour, 1 minute at a time. And so last fall, I ran the 10K of the Marine Corps Marathon. This year, I'm supposed to run the whole darn thing. I'm going to be happy with half. So, a little backstory. You heard some of it. I started out in print in Washington, D.C., and I was writing for a newsletter. Somebody at the Washington Post called me into his office, and he said, we will never hire you from a newsletter. We're snobs. We don't care how many stories you break. You've got to quit your job, go back to school, or go overseas. Now, I ended up doing both. I got a master's in Middle East Studies, and thanks to Wellesley, I went to Egypt. Before going to Cairo, my mom said to me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Same thing she said before I quit my DC newsletter job. And I quote her, "When will you ever get a job that pays you $30,000 a year again?" Thanks, Mom. Parents out there, don't do that. Now is the time we're supposed to be broke. So, within just 2 months of arriving in Cairo, Egypt, I was writing for front page lead story. They only changed 3 words. Wait for it, the Washington Post. And I called my editor from the newsletter, who'd also said I wouldn't get work. It was New Year's Day. He'd been out the night before. I waited till it was like, 5 minutes to 8 a.m. when I knew he'd be really good and groggy. Hey, boss, go outside to your front porch, look at the Washington Post lead story. Happy New Year, click. Good moments. From Egypt, I went to London, and as the newspapers started cutting back, I moved over to radio. Now, radio, I was terrified of doing radio. It wasn't my first choice, but I got better at it, and then I ended up at the front seat of history. I was there when Milosevic gave himself up. I was in Tora Bora as Osama bin Laden disappeared in a puff of smoke off the back of the mountain. Every time I'd end up in a hot zone, though, I'd look left or right, and I'd see these amazing television news teams. And there were these people sharing the burden of working in those hell zones. And they also had resources. My translator, I could afford a $50 a day translator. Theirs was a lot better. So I got broken English, and they got the New York Times. I wanted that. So I went for it, even though I was told time and again I was not a natural for television. And if you'd seen some of my early stand-ups and the particular shade of MAC red I chose for TV, you would agree. But again, somebody gave me a chance, took the long shot, and I ended up with a front row seat of post-invasion Baghdad in 2003. The story I wanted to cover, the place I wanted to be. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. Thank goodness I'd had a hard time coming up, because that was a little bit of preparation for what was to come. This war divided America like no other, and a lot of the blowback landed on the media and whatever we chose to report. Initially, the euphoria in the States over the apparent ease of victory meant it was very hard to put anything critical on the air. So when I publicized Iraqi frustration at the U.S. inability to keep the lights on, turn the water back on, even though Saddam hadn't been able to do those things, didn't matter. Iraqis were angry. I put it on TV. We got a lot of right-wing blowback at CBS. But then when I go out with the U.S. Army Civil Affairs team that was trying to rebuild the infrastructure, I got slammed on the left. This is my favorite quote of all. One blog site called me a corporate pimp for George Bush's illegal war in Iraq. Wow. Then, as the insurgency emerged and grew and car bombs started hitting one neighborhood after another, I'd go in the middle of a neighborhood and stand next to a screaming father and literally pools of blood. And he would be shouting at our cameras, "You were supposed to bring us security," with his dying child there that he was rushing to the hospital. I'd put that on the air, and I earned comments like, "She's a terrorist cheerleader, tearing down our men and women in uniform in Iraq." I felt like a ping pong ball. Which am I, a corporate war pimp or a terrorist cheerleader? You have to have black humor in these situations, because the only way to get through it. In the meantime, it was getting more dangerous to report, and the audience was literally turning off. You put it in the front part of your news show. We measure ratings minute by minute. People would see a story on Iraq and they would change the channel. So my boss is like, "Great, it's costing us $1 million a month to run the bureau. Our people are in danger and no one wants to see this story." It became harder and harder to go out the door. Every time I weighed a story choice, I'd say, this is life or death. One of my cameramen, Paul Douglas, put it best. He said, "Don't risk my life unless we're going to make air." In a horrible way, I kept that promise. Memorial Day 2006. We plan to spend a few hours with the 4th